I call the member for Hughes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Great pleasure to speak and rise on this bill with the Australia-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. Deputy Speaker, if you go back to the year 1965, at the time, Singapore, when they became a nation, you would have to say their prospects did not look good. Here was a small island nation with virtually zero natural resources, a small migrant population, and at that time in 1965 was almost the height of the Vietnam War. We had the North Vietnamese, the communists, wanting to infiltrate the rest of the countries through Southeast Asia. And back in 1965, historically, there was still a legitimate argument about which economic system would provide the greatest prosperity for its citizens. Was it the communist socialist model promoted by Russia and the North Vietnamese, or was it the free market capitalist model promoted by the West? We ask today why Singapore is so successful. And there are two things. Firstly, from Lee Kuan Yew's autobiography, and he spoke about the importance of America's and Australia's intervention in the Vietnam War. And this is from his autobiography. He says, "The communist underground was still active in Singapore at the time of Vietnamese action in Vietnam. Their action enabled the non-communist Southeast Asian nations to put their houses in order. By 1975, the Southeast Asian nations, were in better shape to stand up to the communists. Had there been no US intervention, and of course with Australia's support, the will of these countries to resist would have melted, and Southeast Asia would have most likely gone communist. The prosperous emerging market economies of Asia we see today were nurtured during the Vietnamese year wars." And Singapore, Deputy Speaker, went down the track of free trade. They understood the importance of free trade, how that brings prosperity to your nation. And I was reading an article the other week, Deputy Speaker, and I thought this actually says everything that needs to be said about free trade. It's by a gentleman called Alan Gombeck. I'll quote from his article. He said, Imports are a necessary evil. Imports are not a necessary evil. They are a necessary ingredient. Companies requiring inputs towards a finished product need to get the best price, the best quality, and the best service levels so they can compete. They need the widest potential network of suppliers. Being able to import and therefore obtain the best possible terms and conditions for domestic and foreign suppliers is critical to being able to efficiently make products for export. He continued, "In fact, the opportunity to import helps achieve productivity and prosperity more than the opportunity to export, because it does more to broaden choice. Importing widens the circles of potential suppliers competing to meet the needs of consumers and intermediate producers. It forces domestic companies to become more efficient and compete more effectively. It generates economies of scale, spreading production costs over a wider and larger market. It allows countries to utilise comparative advantage, importing goods and imports from countries that are most efficient at making them, and it transfers knowledge, allowing importers to benefit from technological spillover." That pretty much sums up Singapore's approach. And what have they achieved? One of the most successful and wealthiest societies on the planet. And we contrast that, Deputy Speaker, with those that decided free trade and free market capitalist policies are not the way to go. We look at a nation like Venezuela that, in contrast to Singapore, has more oil wealth than Saudi Arabia, but instead spurned free trade, that said capitalism no good, that went for the thing of equality and social justice. And what do we see in Venezuela today, Deputy Speaker? A nation that once had a higher GDP than Australia, a nation that was ranked once fourth in the world with GDP. We see a nation in absolute collapse. Inflation there, running at 460%. They have the world's worst economic growth at -8%. We see a nation where there are food riots and they slaughter the zoo animals for food. They have one of the highest murder rates in the world. Last year, over 21,000 murders in the nation of Venezuela at a rate of 90 per 100,000. In contrast, Singapore had 16 at a rate of 0.3. In Venezuela, we see the re-emergence of diseases that were once eradicated. Diseases like diphtheria. We see increases in child mortality. And we see the final stages of socialism, is where they even run out of toilet paper. There cannot be a greater contrast, a greater example of between Singapore and Venezuela to show what is the greatest way to create prosperity for a nation's people and their economy. And yet, Deputy Speaker, we still have people in this Parliament and parliaments around, state parliaments around this nation, that argue against free trade. When the evidence is there, the historical evidence is there of how that drives prosperity, we still have so many people that want to argue against free trade. That's why, Deputy Speaker, I am proud of the coalitions, amongst all the wonderful things this coalition government has done. One of the best things that we have done are those free trade agreements with China, with Japan and with South Korea, and now we can add this free trade agreement with Singapore onto the list. Deputy Speaker, just some of the things that this free trade agreement will achieve. Firstly, it enhances our education opportunities. There'll be new opportunities through increased recognition of tertiary qualifications obtained from Australian universities. In the legal field, it will be simpler for Australian lawyers and law firms operating in Singapore to obtain and retain accreditation. The financial markets, Australian financial service providers will now be able to provide services to Singapore, including banking, insurance, fund management, investment advice, portfolio management and brokerage. Professional services will benefit